You are a burden, Marcus. We all want to live without you dragging us down anymore. My sister Rachel said those words at our family Thanksgiving dinner, right after I'd asked if someone could pass the gravy. Not whispered, not implied, declared loudly enough that my 8-year-old nephew stopped eating to stare. Everyone at the table went silent. My mother looked down at her plate. My father cleared his throat, but said nothing. My brother-in-law actually nodded in agreement. I sat there, gravy boat suspended between my brother Thomas and me, watching 17 faces around that dining room table refuse to meet my eyes. These were the people who'd eaten my food, slept in my house, borrowed my money for 20 years. The same people I'd put myself through hell to protect, support, and save. And not one of them defended me. My name is Marcus Delacroix, and yes, before you ask, I'm the same Marcus Delacroix who invented the prosthetic nerve interface that helped paralyzed people walk again. The same one whose medical device company sold for $800 million just 3 years ago. The same one who'd been financially supporting every person at that table since I was 22 years old. The burden comment wasn't about money, they'd already taken plenty of that. It was about my disability. 6 months earlier, I'd been in a car accident caused by my brother Thomas driving drunk with me in the passenger seat. I'd lost my left leg below the knee and suffered nerve damage that left me with chronic pain. The same brother who'd caused my disability was sitting there, letting his wife call me a burden while he carved the turkey I'd paid for. Rachel continued, her voice getting stronger as she sensed the family's silent support. She said I was making everyone uncomfortable with my limitations. That my wheelchair at last month's wedding had ruined the photos. That my pain medication made me difficult to be around. That my prosthetic was disturbing for the children. She actually used the word disturbing, like my medical device was some horror movie prop instead of the reason I could still walk. But here's what made it worse. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. I found out later they'd planned it. The whole family had a group chat called the Marcus Problem, where they'd been discussing how to confront me about being too visible with my disability. They'd decided Thanksgiving was perfect because I couldn't storm out easily with my mobility issues. They'd literally strategized the best way to ambush a disabled person. My mother finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. She said maybe it would be better if I didn't come to family events for a while. Just until I was walking normally again. Until I could contribute like before. She actually said contribute, like my $800 million hadn't bought the house we were sitting in. I looked around that table, at my 3 siblings, their spouses, my parents, my nephews and nieces, my elderly grandmother. Every single one of them had taken my money. House down payments, college tuitions, medical bills, business ventures, cars, vacations. I'd been writing checks since my first patent at MIT, believing family meant you shared success. But apparently, family only meant something when you could walk without a limp. Thomas wouldn't even look at me. The man whose drunk driving had taken my leg was eating mashed potatoes while his wife called me a burden. He'd never apologized, never offered to help with medical bills, never even visited me in the hospital. But I'd still paid off his gambling debts 2 months after the accident because my mother begged me to. I set down the gravy boat, pulled out my phone, and took a photo of everyone at that table. They thought I was being dramatic. My sister actually laughed, saying I was proving her point about making everything about myself. My father told me to put the phone away and stop causing a scene. I stood up, which took effort with my prosthetic, and looked at each of them. Then I said the only words that mattered. Enjoy your last Thanksgiving. My grandmother, 93 and sharp as ever, was the only one who understood. Her face went pale. She knew what I was capable of when pushed too far. She'd watched me build an empire from nothing, destroy competitors who'd tried to steal my patents, and systematically dismantle anyone who'd betrayed me. But she said nothing, just closed her eyes like she was already mourning what was about to happen. I left without another word, driving home in the modified Tesla I'd bought after the accident. They could have my food, my money, even my leg. But calling me a burden? Making my disability something shameful? Planning my humiliation like a military operation? They had no idea what burden really meant. But they were about to learn. Let me paint you the full picture of who I was before Thanksgiving destroyed everything. Marcus Delacroix, 41 years old, started from nothing in Detroit's East Side. My father was a factory worker who got laid off every few years. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Grosse Pointe, coming home with stories about their marble countertops and wine cellars. We lived in a 2-bedroom ranch with bars on the windows and gunshots as lullabies. But I had something my family didn't understand, a brain that saw patterns in everything. At 8, I was taking apart radios and rebuilding them to pick up frequencies they weren't designed for. At 12, I'd rewired our entire house's electrical system to cut our power bill in half. At 15, I built my first prosthetic hand for a neighbor who'd lost his in a factory accident. It was crude, made from bike parts and fishing line, but it worked. He cried when he picked up a coffee mug for the first time in 3 years. MIT came calling with a full scholarship when I was 16. My family thought I was abandoning them, going off to become some educated snob who'd forget where he came from. So I made a promise, whatever I achieved, I'd share with them. Every success would be their success. Every dollar would help lift us all up together. It was a promise that would cost me everything. My lab at MIT was in the basement of Building 32, a windowless cave where I spent 18 hours a day developing neural interfaces. My advisor said I was obsessed. I preferred the term focused. While my classmates were at parties, I was mapping nerve signals, designing circuits that could interpret the brain's commands and translate them into mechanical movement. The first successful test made a paralyzed rat walk again. The second helped a monkey with a severed spine regain control of its arm. The breakthrough came when I was 22. I figured out how to use machine learning to predict nerve signal patterns, essentially teaching prosthetics to anticipate what the user wanted to do. The patent was worth $40 million immediately. Tech companies started a bidding war. But I didn't sell. Instead, I started Delacroix Medical Systems in a warehouse in Cambridge, hired 3 brilliant engineers who believed in the vision, and got to work making devices that would change lives. My family's reaction to my success was immediate and overwhelming. Rachel needed money for law school. Thomas wanted to start a restaurant. My younger brother Christopher had a startup idea. My parents' house needed repairs. Everyone had their hand out, and I filled everyone. Why wouldn't I? We'd grown up sharing everything. When we had nothing, we split it equally. Now that I had something, the same rules should apply. The office I built was deliberately modest, no executive suite, no corporate ostentation. Just a workspace designed for innovation. The walls were covered with thank you letters from patients. A 7-year-old who could finally throw a baseball. A veteran who could hold his daughter again. A pianist who returned to the stage after losing her arm. These weren't just customers, they were proof that technology could restore human dignity. I lived in a converted loft in Boston's Fort Point district. Nothing fancy, just exposed brick and good light. I needed a first-floor unit after the accident, something wheelchair accessible for the bad days. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who designed the world's most advanced prosthetics couldn't design away his own pain. My left leg, amputated below the knee after Thomas's drunk driving, had become my test case for every new innovation. My days before Thanksgiving followed a routine. Physical therapy at 5 a.m., when the clinic was empty and I didn't have to explain my situation to anyone. Work from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., sometimes later. Evening calls with the overseas manufacturing teams. Then home to test modifications on my own prosthetic, using myself as a guinea pig for improvements. The pain was constant phantom limb syndrome mixed with nerve damage, but work was the only thing that made it fade into background noise. The one bright spot in my life was Dr. Kira Nakamura, my neurologist at Mass General. She'd been treating me since the accident, and somewhere between discussing nerve regeneration and prosthetic integration, we'd become friends. Maybe more than friends, though neither of us had acknowledged it. She understood my work in a way my family never had, saw the elegance in the engineering, the poetry in making broken bodies whole again. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I'd achieved something remarkable. A full neural integration with sensory feedback, a prosthetic that could actually feel. Temperature, pressure, texture. I called my mother to share the news. She asked if I was still taking those pills, meaning my pain medication, and said she hoped I wasn't becoming an addict like Cousin Jerome. Then she reminded me to bring my checkbook to Thanksgiving because Rachel needed help with her mortgage. If you're still watching, drop a comment. I need to know I'm not alone in this, that others have felt this betrayal from people who should love you most. The signs had been building for months before Thanksgiving, small fractures in family loyalty that I'd explained away as stress, misunderstanding, temporary frustration. Looking back, I was like a frog in slowly boiling water, not realizing I was being cooked until it was too late. It started the day after the accident. I woke up in Mass General missing my left leg, multiple surgeries behind me, machines beeping my survival. The first thing I saw was an empty room. No family. A nurse told me they'd been there earlier but had to leave. Thomas had a restaurant inspection he couldn't miss. My parents had work. Rachel had a client meeting. They'd left while I was unconscious, priorities clearly established. When I finally got visitors 3 days later, the conversation wasn't about my recovery or the trauma of losing a limb. My mother wanted to know if the accident would affect my company's stock value. Rachel asked if I'd still be able to make the down payment on her new condo. Thomas, who'd been driving drunk when he crashed us into that concrete barrier, actually asked if my insurance would cover the damage to his BMW. The police report was damning. Thomas's blood alcohol was 0.18, more than twice the legal limit. He'd run a red light, been speeding, and had cocaine in his system. But my family convinced me not to press charges. He had a family, they said. A criminal record would ruin his restaurant business. Think of his kids. So I stayed quiet, paid for my own medical bills, even helped him get his license back by writing a character reference to the judge. 2 weeks into recovery, I overheard my sister on the phone in the hospital hallway. She was talking to her husband and didn't know I could hear. She said the accident might actually be good for the family. Maybe it would make me more generous, more aware of my mortality. Maybe I'd finally set up those trust funds she'd been asking about. She actually used the phrase silver lining while I was learning to stand on one leg. The hospital bills were astronomical. Even with excellent insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses reached 6 figures. Custom prosthetics, private physical therapy, home modifications, specialized equipment. Not a single family member offered to help. When I mentioned the costs during a family dinner, my father changed the subject to his need for a new car. He was getting old, embarrassed to drive to church. Could I help? Physical therapy was a special kind of hell. 3 hours every morning, relearning to walk, to balance, to trust a mechanical limb where flesh used to be. The therapist said family support was crucial for recovery. I told her my family was busy. She gave me a look that said she'd heard that before, from other patients whose families couldn't handle disability. The first family event after the accident was my nephew's birthday party. I'd been home for a week, still figuring out the prosthetic, using a cane for stability. When I arrived, my sister asked me to stay in the living room rather than join everyone in the backyard. The uneven ground might be dangerous, she said. But really, she didn't want me visible in the party photos. I could hear them laughing outside while I sat alone, birthday present in my lap, wondering when I'd become something to hide. My brother Christopher, the youngest, was the most creative in his cruelty. He started a family group chat about planning events at non-accessible venues. Hiking trips, beach houses with stairs, restaurants without ramps. When I pointed out I couldn't participate, he said I was being too sensitive, that not everything had to revolve around my limitations. The others agreed. My mother said I needed to stop feeling sorry for myself. Then came the financial manipulation. Rachel discovered I'd been putting money aside for adaptive technology research, devices specifically for amputees. She called it selfish and said I was prioritizing strangers over family. Why was I funding research when her kids needed college funds? When Thomas needed investment for his second restaurant? When our parents deserved a better house? My disability had made me self-centered, she said. The medication issue became their favorite weapon. I needed opioids for nerve pain, carefully managed, monitored by Dr. Nakamura, absolutely necessary for function. But my family treated it like junkie behavior. They'd exchange looks when I took pills. make comments about addiction running in families. My mother started hiding her purse when I visited, as if I might steal from her for drug money. The man who'd given them millions was suddenly treated like a criminal for managing documented chronic pain. Thomas was the worst because he felt guilty, and guilt made him cruel. He'd point out other amputees who seemed fine, athletes with prosthetics who ran marathons. Why couldn't I be like them? Why was I making such a big deal about it? He'd caused my disability while high on cocaine and drunk on whiskey, but somehow I was the one with the drug problem for taking prescribed medication. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, they held an intervention. Not for Thomas's drinking or cocaine use. For my attitude. They said I'd become negative, difficult, and focused too much on my disability. My mother cried about wanting her old son back. Rachel said I was traumatizing the children by letting them see my prosthetic. Christopher suggested I might benefit from therapy to accept my new limitations gracefully. I recorded that entire conversation on my phone. 2 hours of my family telling me I was handling my amputation wrong, that I was making them uncomfortable, that I needed to be more positive. Not one of them acknowledged Thomas's role in causing it. Not one offered actual help. They just wanted me to hide my disability better so they could pretend nothing had changed. Thanksgiving Day started with such false hope. I'd woken up pain-free for the first time in months. The new nerve block Dr. Nakamura had suggested actually working. My prosthetic was functioning perfectly, the new model I'd designed with sensory feedback that would revolutionize the industry. I could feel the floor beneath my mechanical foot, distinguish carpet from hardwood, hot from cold. I felt almost whole. I'd even bought gifts for everyone, trying to bridge whatever gap had formed. A new laptop for Christopher's startup. Diamond earrings for my mother. Patriots season tickets for Thomas, his favorite team. Each gift was carefully chosen to show I still knew them, still cared, despite everything. I loaded them into my modified Tesla, using the wheelchair lift I'd had installed for bad days, though today I could walk steadily with just the prosthetic. The drive to my parents' house in Wellesley, the one I'd bought them 5 years ago, took 40 minutes. I listened to a podcast about resilience, about turning trauma into triumph. The host was interviewing a war veteran who'd lost both legs and become a motivational speaker. He talked about how family support saved his life. I turned it off, suddenly nauseous. When I arrived, the house was full of cars, but nobody came out to help. I could see them through the window, all gathered in the living room, talking animatedly. It took me 3 trips to bring in the gifts and the wine I'd brought, a case of the expensive Bordeaux my father pretended to understand. My prosthetic was aching by the 3rd trip, but I managed. Inside, the conversation stopped when I entered. 23 relatives, including some cousins I hadn't seen since before the accident, were all suddenly fascinated by their phones or the ceiling or anything but me. My grandmother was in her chair by the fireplace, and she alone looked at me directly, something like a warning in her eyes. I tried to act normal, asking about everyone's lives, their kids, their jobs. Got monosyllabic responses. When I mentioned my breakthrough with sensory feedback prosthetics, my aunt actually yawned. When I asked Thomas about his restaurant, he grunted something about it being fine and walked away. The gifts I'd brought sat unopened in the corner like evidence of a crime. Dinner was called, and I took my usual seat, the one I'd occupied for 41 years of family dinners. Rachel immediately said I should sit at the end instead, easier for my leg, she claimed, though the end seat was actually harder to navigate to. When I declined, she exchanged looks with Thomas and my mother. The first sign was coordinated. The prayer before dinner was pointed. My father thanked God for health, for wholeness, for family members who contributed to rather than took from the family's well-being. He actually emphasized wholeness while looking directly at my prosthetic. When he finished, everyone said amen extra loudly, like they were agreeing with the subtext rather than the prayer. That's when I made the mistake of asking for the gravy. Rachel's speech was clearly rehearsed. She'd practiced the rhythm, the pauses, the emotional beats. She talked about how difficult the last 6 months had been for the family, not for me. How my disability had become the center of every gathering. How my needs dominated every conversation. How my limitations restricted what the family could do together. She used corporate speak, talking about family dynamics and group functionality, like we were a business and I was the underperforming division. Then came the specific complaints. The wheelchair at Cousin Lisa's wedding last month. My inability to play football at the 4th of July picnic. The way I walked too slowly at the mall. The sound my prosthetic made on hardwood floors. The pills I took with dinner. Each grievance delivered with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. My mother added her own twist. She said seeing me struggle made her too sad, that it would be better if I healed in private and returned when I could be myself again. As if I was broken machinery that needed to be fixed off-site. She actually suggested I might want to live in a facility for a while, somewhere with people trained to deal with my kind of situation. Thomas finally spoke, the man whose cocaine-fueled drunk driving had caused this entire situation. He said I was using the accident as an excuse to make everyone feel guilty. That I'd always been manipulative with money, but now I was being manipulative with disability too. He actually accused me of exaggerating my limitations for sympathy, and said he'd seen me walk fine when I thought no one was watching. Christopher pulled out his phone, showed me a video he'd secretly recorded of me at physical therapy, struggling to climb stairs. He'd annotated it with comments about how disturbing it was to watch, how the children shouldn't have to see their uncle like this. He'd shared it in their group chat, the Marcus problem, where they'd been planning this intervention for weeks. My 8-year-old nephew, Thomas's son, asked why Uncle Marcus walked like a robot. Thomas laughed, actually laughed, and said that's what happens when people don't take care of themselves. The child I'd set up a college fund for was being taught that my disability was my fault. Rachel pulled out a printed document. They'd actually created a family contract. Terms included, I would attend therapy to accept my limitations, I would refrain from discussing my disability or medical situation, I would not attend events where my mobility might be an issue. I would continue financial support, but without expecting inclusion in family activities. They wanted me to sign it. They'd brought it to Thanksgiving dinner with a notary cousin ready to make it official. The room was silent, waiting for my response. My grandmother's hands were shaking, but she said nothing. 40 years of my financial support, 20 years of paying for their lives, 6 months of dealing with a disability caused by one of them, and this was their response. A contract to formalize my exile. I drove home from that Thanksgiving in a state of shock that slowly crystallized into rage. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over twice, sitting in gas station parking lots trying to process what had just happened. My family hadn't just rejected me, they'd planned my exile, documented my humiliation, tried to contractualize my status as less than human. Back in my empty loft, I stood at the window looking out at Boston's skyline, city lights blurring through tears I hadn't realized were falling. The pain in my residual limb was screaming, nerve endings firing in protest after the stress of the day. I dry swallowed 3 pills, not caring that my family would call it junkie behavior. Physical pain was nothing compared to what was happening in my chest. I pulled up the group chat Christopher had shown me, the Marcus problem. He'd accidentally left me access when he'd connected his phone to my car's Bluetooth months ago, syncing his messages. I scrolled through weeks of planning. They'd discussed everything, how to confront me, what words to use, how to position themselves in the room for maximum impact. Rachel had actually written stage directions. The cruelest messages were from Thomas. The man whose drunk driving had taken my leg was complaining about how my disability made him feel guilty. How he couldn't enjoy family gatherings with me there as a reminder of his mistake. He actually called my presence a form of emotional manipulation and said I was weaponizing my amputation against him. The others agreed, comforting him, telling him it wasn't his fault I couldn't move on. 3 a.m, I found myself in my home workshop, the place where I'd designed the prosthetics that had made me rich. The walls were covered with technical drawings, patent certificates, photos from medical journals featuring my devices. In the corner was my first successful prototype, the one that had started everything. I picked it up, this piece of engineered titanium and silicon that had changed thousands of lives, and threw it against the wall. It shattered, pieces scattering across the floor like my family had scattered from my life. Dr. Nakamura called the next morning. She'd seen my medical alert. My heart rate and blood pressure had been dangerously elevated for hours, triggered by the monitors in my prosthetic. She asked if I was okay. I told her about Thanksgiving, about the contract, about being called a burden by people I'd supported for decades. The silence on her end lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she said something that changed everything. She said my family's behavior wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. Discrimination against disability, conspiracy to commit fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress. She asked if I documented anything. When I told her about the recording, the group chat, the contract they'd tried to make me sign, she gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in disability rights and family law. But more importantly, she reminded me of something. I owned everything they had. I spent the next 3 days in my home office, mapping out the financial web I'd created over 20 years. Every house I'd bought, every business I'd funded, every loan I'd given, I'd done it all through my company, with proper documentation, with legal agreements they'd signed without reading. My family had been so eager to take my money, they'd never noticed the terms. Every asset had reverter clauses. Every loan had acceleration provisions. Every gift had been structured as a revocable trust. My father had taught me when I was young to always protect yourself in business, even with family. Especially with family, he'd said, because family will betray you faster than strangers when money's involved. Ironic that his own advice would be his downfall. My grandmother called on day 4. She was crying, said she was ashamed of what happened, that she should have spoken up. But she was 93, dependent on my parents for care, afraid of being put in a home if she defended me. She told me something crucial. My parents had been planning this for months, ever since they'd learned about my new neural feedback technology. They thought if they pushed me out now, before the patent was finalized, they could claim rights to it as family members who'd supported my career. That's when I understood. This wasn't about my disability. It was about the $100 million patent I was about to file. They thought if they broke me emotionally, made me sign their contract, they'd have leverage to claim part of my new invention. The disability discrimination was just the weapon, money was the motive. I called the attorney Dr. Nakamura had recommended. Her name was Sharon Winters, and she'd lost her own arm in Afghanistan before becoming a lawyer. When I told her the story, she laughed, actually laughed, and said it was the stupidest criminal conspiracy she'd ever heard. Did they really think they could steal from a disabled person by calling them a burden? She took the case immediately, working on contingency because she wanted to destroy them almost as much as I did. But legal revenge wasn't enough. The law might get me justice, but I wanted more. I wanted them to feel what I'd felt, the shock of abandonment, the pain of betrayal, the fear of losing everything. I wanted them to understand what burden really meant. I started making calls. Every banker who'd given them loans based on my co-signature. Every vendor who'd extended credit because of my guarantee. Every connection who'd hired them because of my recommendation. Time to collect on 20 years of favors. The plan formed with the precision of a medical device schematic. Each component had to work perfectly, every connection had to hold, or the whole system would fail. I spent a week designing my family's destruction like I'd design a prosthetic, carefully, methodically, with no room for error. First, I needed intelligence. I hired a forensic accountant named David Chin, recommended by Sharon Winters. David specialized in unraveling family financial fraud, and what he found in 48 hours was staggering. My family hadn't just been taking my money, they'd been stealing it. False invoices for Thomas's restaurant, Rachel billing me for legal work she never did, Christopher claiming startup expenses for a company that didn't exist. Over $3 million in fraudulent charges over 5 years. But the real discovery was their secret partnership. They'd formed an LLC called Delacroix Holdings without my knowledge, using forged signatures to list me as a silent partner. They'd been using this company to take loans against my assets, building a debt pyramid that relied entirely on my continued financial support. If I pulled out, the whole structure would collapse within days. Sharon Winters crafted the legal strategy with military precision. We wouldn't just sue, we'd systematically trigger every legal clause I'd built into their support structure. The houses I'd bought them? The deeds had occupancy requirements they'd violated. The business loans? They had performance metrics that hadn't been met. The trust funds? They had moral turpitude clauses that their discrimination triggered. I started documenting everything obsessively. Every text, every email, every voicemail. Rachel made it easy. She couldn't resist sending me articles about inspiring amputees, passive-aggressive messages about people who'd overcome worse situations. Each one screenshot, cataloged, added to the evidence file that grew larger every day. The emotional manipulation continued. My mother called crying, saying I was tearing the family apart by not signing their contract. She actually said I was being selfish, that my refusal to accept their terms was hurting the children. The same children didn't want to see my prosthetic. I recorded every call, her voice becoming evidence of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Christopher tried a different approach. He showed up at my office with a business proposal and said we could work together on adaptive technology. But the terms were insulting. He wanted 50% ownership for contributing nothing but his presence. When I refused, he said I'd changed, that money and disability had made me paranoid and mean. He actually accused me of discriminating against him for being able-bodied. Dr. Nakamura became my unexpected strategic advisor. She'd seen this pattern before: families who couldn't handle disability, who turned cruel when faced with imperfection. She connected me with a support group of successful disabled professionals who'd faced similar betrayals. Their stories were eerily similar: families who'd taken their money while rejecting their disabilities, who'd treated them as ATMs with acceptable limitations. One member of the group, a tech CEO named James who'd lost his sight, gave me the best advice. Don't just take back what they stole. Take everything they thought they'd earned. Make them understand that their cruelty cost them a future they'd already spent. I started with small moves. Canceled the credit cards I'd given them for emergencies. Changed the passwords on the streaming services I paid for. Removed them as authorized users on accounts. Petty? Yes. But watching them complain on social media about having to pay for their own Netflix was deeply satisfying. Then came the strategic strikes. I called Thomas's restaurant landlord, reminded him that I was the actual lease guarantor, and formally withdrew my guarantee effective in 30 days. Without my backing, Thomas would have to qualify on his own credit, which was destroyed by gambling debts I'd been quietly paying. Rachel's law firm got an anonymous tip about her billing fraud. Not from me directly, Sharon Winters handled it through appropriate channels. But suddenly Rachel was under investigation by the Bar Association, her partnership in jeopardy, her reputation crumbling as clients learned she'd been stealing from her disabled brother. Christopher's startup investors received detailed documentation of his falsified credentials and fraudulent use of funds. Turns out he'd been telling them he was the co-inventor of my patents, using my reputation to raise capital. When they learned the truth, they didn't just pull funding, they sued him for fraud. My parents were trickier. They'd been careful, mostly living off the money I gave them rather than stealing directly. But David Chin found their weakness: taxes. They hadn't reported most of my gifts as income, structuring them as loans they never intended to repay. The IRS would be very interested in 20 years of tax evasion. But the masterstroke was the Delacroix Holdings discovery. The LLC they'd created to steal from me had one fatal flaw: it was registered in Delaware, where fraud charges carry mandatory jail time. They'd committed wire fraud across state lines, a federal crime. Sharon Winters practically glowed when she explained how much trouble they were in. The first counterattack came through emotional warfare. My mother showed up at my office with 2 police officers, claiming I was having a mental health crisis and needed involuntary commitment. She'd actually tried to Baker Act me, telling them I was disabled, on pain medication, and making threats against the family. The officers were apologetic but had to investigate. Sharon Winters arrived within minutes. I'd given her emergency authority for exactly this situation. She presented my medical records, Dr. Nakamura's assessment of my perfect mental health, and recordings of my mother admitting she wanted me institutionalized for being disabled. The officers left with a warning to my mother about filing false reports. But the damage to my reputation had begun. My mother had called several of my business partners, telling them I was unstable, that the accident had changed my personality, that I couldn't be trusted with major decisions. Two investors pulled out of a project worth $40 million. My board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss my fitness to lead. I walked into that boardroom with my prosthetic deliberately visible, no longer hiding it under tailored pants. I presented them with everything: the discrimination, the fraud, the conspiracy to steal my patents. Then I showed them my latest innovation, a neural interface that restored sensation so perfectly that amputees could feel their children's faces again. The board not only supported me, they offered to testify about my mother's interference with company business. The second setback was personal. Someone, I suspected Rachel, had leaked to medical journals that I was using myself as a test subject for unapproved devices. The FDA launched an investigation into my personal use of experimental prosthetics. It was perfectly legal, but the investigation froze my patent applications, delaying the $100 million deal I'd been negotiating. Dr. Nakamura went to war for me. She provided detailed documentation that every modification to my prosthetic was medically supervised, that I was the most qualified person in the world to test my own devices. She even published a paper about the ethics of inventor patients, turning their attack into academic recognition of my work. Thomas tried physical intimidation next. He showed up at my apartment at 2 a.m., drunk and high again, pounding on the door and screaming about how I was destroying the family. He actually tried to break down the door, not realizing I'd installed security cameras after the Thanksgiving incident. The footage of him threatening to finish what he'd started in the car accident was crystal clear. The restraining order was granted immediately, but Thomas violated it within hours, showing up at my physical therapy session. He told everyone there that I was exaggerating my disability, that I could walk fine when I wanted to. The other patients, veterans, accident survivors, people fighting to rebuild their bodies, turned on him instantly. Security had to escort him out while a double amputee Marine called him a disgrace. Rachel made the mistake of putting her harassment in writing. She sent emails to my entire contact list, including business partners and medical colleagues, claiming I was a drug addict who'd become paranoid and delusional. She included edited videos of me taking pain medication, cropped to look suspicious. She even suggested people should be careful around me, implying I might be dangerous. Sharon Winters was ecstatic. Written defamation with provable damages to a disabled person was a prosecutor's dream. Each email was a separate count, each recipient a witness to disability discrimination. Rachel had just handed us a multi-million-dollar lawsuit tied up with a bow. The family tried to rally relatives against me. They called cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends, spinning a story about how I'd become vengeful since the accident. But they'd miscalculated. Many of these relatives had their own disabilities or had watched loved ones struggle. My cousin Marie, whose son had cerebral palsy, was particularly disgusted. She sent me screenshots of everything they'd said, building our evidence file even larger. My grandmother called with a warning. My parents were planning to claim power of attorney, arguing I wasn't competent to manage my affairs due to pain medication and emotional distress. They'd found a doctor, someone my father knew from his club, willing to sign off on it for a price. If successful, they'd control everything I owned. That's when I decided to stop playing defense. Sharon Winters filed the lawsuit the next morning. Not just one lawsuit, 17 separate actions. Fraud, conspiracy, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, disability discrimination, violation of civil rights, theft, breach of fiduciary duty, and more. We named everyone: parents, siblings, their spouses, even the family LLC they'd created. The damages requested totaled $400 million, every penny they'd taken plus punitive damages for disability discrimination. Sharon Winters made sure to file in federal court, where the proceedings would be public record, searchable by anyone who Googled their names. The process server delivered the papers during Sunday dinner at my parents' house. I knew because Christopher live-streamed it on Instagram, thinking he was documenting my harassment. Instead, he broadcast their panic as they realized the scope of what was coming. My mother fainted genuinely this time. My father threw a plate against the wall. Rachel started crying about her career. Thomas just sat there, finally understanding that his drunk driving had started an avalanche that would bury them all. But the real blow came Monday morning. David Chin had finished his forensic accounting, and the results were sent simultaneously to the IRS, the FBI, and the Massachusetts Attorney General. 20 years of tax evasion, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering. Yes, racketeering, because they'd operated as an organized crime family stealing from a disabled person. The asset freeze was immediate. Every bank account, every property, every investment they had was locked pending investigation. Rachel couldn't pay her mortgage. Thomas couldn't make payroll at his restaurant. Christopher's credit cards were declined at Starbucks, which he also live-streamed, not realizing he was documenting his own downfall. The demolition began at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. I sat in Sharon Winters's conference room, surrounded by lawyers, accountants, and federal investigators, watching 20 years of careful planning come to fruition. First came the foreclosures. Every property I'd bought for my family had been structured as a trust with me as the primary trustee. A simple revocation letter, notarized and delivered, meant they had 30 days to vacate. My parents' Wellesley mansion, Rachel's Boston condo, Thomas's suburban house, all reverting to my control. The beauty was they'd all sign the trust documents without reading them, too eager for free houses to notice the conditions. The business destruction happened simultaneously. Thomas's restaurant had its licenses suspended when health inspectors received an anonymous tip about cocaine use in the kitchen. Security footage I'd saved from my previous visits showing Thomas doing lines while preparing food. Rachel's law firm received the full documentation of her billing fraud, along with evidence she'd been using client trust funds for personal expenses. Christopher's startup investors got proof he'd never graduated from MIT, as claimed. He'd actually dropped out sophomore year, but had been lying for a decade. By noon, my family's professional lives were over. Thomas's restaurant was shuttered, staff walking out after learning they hadn't been paid employment taxes for 6 months. Rachel was suspended pending disbarment, her office locked, her partners distancing themselves like she had leprosy. Christopher's investors weren't just pulling funding, they were suing for fraud, seeking personal assets he didn't have because everything was in my name. The IRS moved faster than expected. Treasury agents showed up at my parents' house with warrants, seizing everything for evidence of tax evasion. They took computers, files, even the safe where my father kept cash he'd never reported. My mother tried to claim spousal innocence, but agents found her signature on dozens of fraudulent returns. They were both arrested on federal charges by evening. The arrest was perfectly timed. I'd made sure local news got an anonymous tip about a major federal raid in Wellesley. 3 news vans were there when my parents were let out in handcuffs. My mother tried to hide her face, but the cameras caught everything. My father, the man who'd called me a burden, shuffled out like the criminal he'd always been, just better dressed. Rachel's arrest came the next day. The Bar Association had fast-tracked their investigation when they discovered she'd stolen from multiple disabled clients, not just me. She'd been targeting vulnerable people for years, taking advantage of those dealing with accidents and injuries. When investigators searched her office, they found she'd stolen over $2 million from people who'd trusted her with their settlements. Thomas lasted 3 days before the cocaine possession charges hit. The restaurant security footage had captured him dealing to staff, selling cocaine out of the kitchen he'd bought with my money. The DEA got involved when they realized he was connected to a larger distribution network. The man who'd cost me my leg was looking at 20 years for drug trafficking. Christopher tried to run. He actually bought a plane ticket to Costa Rica with the last credit card that still worked. TSA stopped him at Logan Airport. Turns out fleeing while under federal investigation is a bad idea. His arrest was the most pathetic, crying at the gate while families with children watched, begging officers to let him call me, saying I'd fix everything like I always had. Dr. Nakamura attended the legal proceedings as my medical advocate, ensuring the court understood the full impact of my family's discrimination. She testified about my pain levels, my extraordinary recovery despite family abandonment, and the psychological trauma of being called a burden by those who'd caused my disability. Her testimony was clinical, devastating, and perfect. My grandmother was the star witness. At 93, she commanded the courtroom's complete attention. She'd brought 40 years of journals documenting my family's fraud, their cruelty, their systematic exploitation of my success. She read entries about my mother laughing at my first prosthetic design, my father calling me a weak child for caring about other people's disabilities, my siblings planning to steal my patents while I was still in college. The judge actually stopped her at one point, needing a break from the systematic abuse she was describing. The media coverage was relentless. Family calls disabled inventor burden, while stealing millions, became the headline that destroyed any sympathy they might have garnered. The photos of me with my prosthetic next to images of them in handcuffs told the story better than any article. Disability rights organizations picked up the cause, turning my family into the national face of discrimination. But the killing blow was the patent announcement. While my family was being arrested, I held a press conference announcing my new neural feedback technology. I demonstrated it live, showing how my prosthetic could feel textures, temperatures, even heartbeats. I picked up a rose and described feeling each petal, then crushed it and explained the sensation of destruction. Looking directly at the cameras, I said this technology would be available at cost to any amputee whose family had abandoned them. The contrast was clear. While they'd called me a burden, I'd been creating miracles. The trial began 6 months after Thanksgiving, federal court in Boston. All 4 family members tried together for conspiracy. They'd wanted separate trials, but the judge ruled their crimes were too interconnected. They had to sit together at the defendant's table, the family unit they'd so carefully protected now their prison. I testified for 6 hours. Sharon Winters had prepared me thoroughly, but nothing really prepares you to face your family across a courtroom and detail their cruelty. I started with the accident, describing waking up without my leg while Thomas was getting high in the hospital parking lot. I explained every surgery, every physical therapy session they'd missed, every moment of pain I'd endured alone while they planned their theft. The prosecutor played the Thanksgiving recording. The courtroom was silent except for Rachel's voice calling me a burden, my mother suggesting I be institutionalized, Thomas laughing about my prosthetic, Christopher mocking my walk. Several jurors were crying by the end. One, a veteran with a visible prosthetic arm, had to be excused because he couldn't remain impartial. The financial evidence was overwhelming. David Chin presented charts showing money flowing from my accounts to theirs like blood from an artery. $3 million in direct theft, $20 million in fraudulent loans, $40 million in forged contracts. He showed how they'd lived entirely on my income while building the narrative that I was the dependent one. Rachel tried to testify in her own defense. She claimed I'd changed after the accident, becoming paranoid and vindictive. But Sharon Winters destroyed her on cross-examination, showing text messages where Rachel bragged about manipulating me, emails where she'd called me a cash cow with a limp, documents where she'd tried to get power of attorney to control my patents. By the time Sharon was done, Rachel was sobbing, admitting everything, begging for mercy. Thomas took a different approach, blame the drugs. He claimed cocaine had impaired his judgment, that he wasn't responsible for his actions. The prosecutor reminded him that he'd been sober when planning to institutionalize me, sober when calling me a burden, sober when violating the restraining order. His own lawyer looked disgusted. My parents didn't testify on advice of counsel, but their silence spoke volumes. They sat there, aging before the court's eyes, watching their children turn on each other to save themselves. My mother kept trying to make eye contact with me, mouthing, "I'm sorry," whenever the jury wasn't looking. My father just stared at his hands, finally understanding that his cruelty had cost him everything. The verdict took 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Federal conspiracy, wire fraud, tax evasion, racketeering, and for Rachel and Thomas, additional counts of assault and drug trafficking. The judge called it the worst case of family exploitation he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. He said my family had turned love into a weapon, disability into an excuse for cruelty, and blood into a license to steal. Sentencing was immediate. My father got 15 years federal, my mother got 12. Rachel got 18 for the additional theft from other disabled clients. Thomas got 25 for the drug trafficking and causing the accident that started everything. Christopher got 8 years, the lightest sentence because he was deemed more follower than leader. But 8 years in federal prison for a soft suburban kid would feel like eternity. The asset forfeiture was complete. Every house, every car, every piece of jewelry my money had bought was returned to me. The restaurant, the law practice, the fake startup, all liquidated to pay restitution to their other victims. My family left court owning literally nothing except the prison uniforms they'd wear for the next decade. The civil trial was almost anticlimactic. With criminal convictions secured, the disability discrimination case was a formality. The jury awarded me $60 million in damages, every penny they'd stolen plus punitive damages for the emotional distress of being called a burden by those who'd caused my disability. The judgment would follow them forever, garnishing any income they'd ever make after prison. But the true revenge came from an unexpected source. The media coverage had made my family infamous, but it had also made my story inspirational. Orders for my prosthetics increased 10,000%. The neural feedback technology was fast-tracked by the FDA. Major tech companies entered bidding wars for licensing rights. My company's valuation went from $300 million to $3 billion in 6 months. I used the money to establish the Burden Foundation. Yes, I named it that deliberately. It provides free prosthetics to amputees whose families have abandoned them, legal services for disabled people facing discrimination, and grants for accessibility modifications. The foundation's first recipients were other victims of my sister Rachel's theft. Watching them get justice with my resources was more satisfying than any verdict. Life after destroying your entire family is quieter than you'd expect. I moved to Seattle, as far from Boston as I could get while staying in the country. Bought a house on the water, nothing ostentatious, just peaceful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound, where I could watch the ferries and forget that families were supposed to love each other. The prosthetics company ran itself now, brilliant people I'd hired taking my designs and making them better. I still worked, but remotely, testing new neural interfaces on myself in my home lab. The FDA had given me special permission after the trial, recognizing that my self-testing had advanced prosthetic technology by decades. Every modification I made to my own leg helped thousands of others walk, feel, live. Dr. Nakamura visited monthly, professionally at first, then personally. We'd have dinner, discuss medical journals, and avoid talking about how our relationship had shifted from doctor-patient to something else. 6 months after the trial, she kissed me in my lab, surrounded by prosthetic prototypes, and said she'd been waiting for me to be ready. We weren't ready yet, but we were getting there. The letters from prison started immediately. My father wrote weekly pages of justification and blame, never quite apologizing. My mother sent cards for every holiday, acting like I might forget she'd tried to institutionalize me if she wished me happy Arbor Day. Rachel's letters were legal threats at first, then bargaining, then just begging. Thomas never wrote. His cellmate told me later he'd tried, but couldn't figure out what to say to the man whose leg he'd taken. Christopher was the only one who seemed to understand. His letters were short, factual. He was in therapy, real therapy, learning about narcissistic family systems and golden child syndrome. He wrote that prison was the first place he'd ever had to succeed or fail on his own merits. He was teaching literacy to other inmates, using skills I'd paid for him to learn at private schools. He never asked for forgiveness, just updated me on his progress. The extended family split into camps. Some supported me, horrified by what they'd learned during the trial. Others blamed me for airing family business publicly, destroying the Delacroix name. I didn't care about either camp. Family had become a meaningless concept, blood just a biological coincidence with no inherent loyalty attached. My grandmother lived another year after the trial. I moved her to Seattle, got her the best care, and visited daily. She was the only family I claimed. Before she died, she told me she was proud of me, not for revenge but for surviving it. She said watching me walk on my prosthetic with dignity while they walked to prison in shame was the only justice she'd needed to see. The Burden Foundation grew beyond my expectations. We'd helped 3,000 amputees in the first year, not just with prosthetics, but with life. Job training, education, therapy, legal services. Every success story was a small revenge against my family's cruelty. The kid from Detroit who lost his legs in a drive-by became a Paralympic athlete. The woman whose husband left her after her amputation started her own business. The veteran my family would have called a burden became a senator. I dated occasionally, mostly women who understood disability because they lived it. A blind programmer who laughed at my family's stupidity in underestimating us. A wheelchair user who ran marathons and said my story inspired her to cut off her own toxic family. But nothing stuck. Dr. Nakamura, Kira, remained constant, patient, understanding that some wounds take longer to heal than others. The nightmares were the worst part. Not about the accident or the amputation, but about Thanksgiving dinner. That moment when 23 faces turned away from me, when silence endorsed my sister's cruelty, when family became a weapon aimed at my heart. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., phantom pain screaming through my missing leg, remembering my 8-year-old nephew asking why I walked like a robot while his father laughed. Today marks exactly 3 years since Thanksgiving. I'm sitting in my Seattle office, looking at a wall of photos, not family pictures, but images of people walking on my prosthetics. Thousands of them, living full lives with technology born from my pain. Each one a reminder that burden is just a word weak people use when they can't handle someone else's strength. My family members are still in prison. Thomas has 17 years left, Rachel 15, my parents about 9 each, Christopher 5. I could have forgiven the theft, maybe even the discrimination. But calling me a burden while they lived entirely off my success? Making my disability something shameful while they profited from my innovations? That was unforgivable. The company is worth $8 billion now. The neural feedback technology revolutionized not just prosthetics, but all human-machine interfaces. Paralyzed people are walking, blind people are seeing through electronic eyes, and deaf people are hearing through digital implants, all based on technology one developed while my family planned my exile. The irony is perfect. They called me broken while I was fixing humanity. Last month, I got a call from Christopher's lawyer. He wanted to know if I'd write a letter supporting early release, say something about rehabilitation and family forgiveness. I asked if Christopher still thought I was a burden. The lawyer went quiet, then admitted Christopher had used that exact word in a recent psychological evaluation, saying I was a burden on his conscience. I hung up without responding. The Burden Foundation just opened its 15th clinic, this one in Detroit, blocks from where I grew up. We offer free prosthetics, no questions asked, no insurance needed. The waiting room has a sign I insisted on: no burden too heavy, no person too broken. My family's cruelty became a mission statement for helping others. Kira and I are getting married next month. Small ceremony, just her family who've embraced me completely despite, or maybe because of, my story. Her father, also a doctor, said anyone who could survive what I survived and still create beauty deserved to be loved. Her mother, who uses a wheelchair after a stroke, said my family's loss was their gain. I still test new prosthetics on myself. The latest model can sense individual raindrops, distinguish silk from cotton, and detect temperature changes of less than a degree. When I walk, it's smoother than most people with original legs. The sound it makes on hardwood floors, the sound my family found so disturbing, has been eliminated. Not for them, but for the teenager who wrote saying his classmates mocked the clicking of his prosthetic. People ask if I regret destroying my family. The honest answer is no. They destroyed themselves the moment they called a disabled person a burden while living off his success. I just made sure the world saw it happen. Their punishment wasn't revenge, it was consequence. Every day they spend in prison is a day they chose when they laughed at my pain. The phantom pain still comes, especially at night. But now I understand it differently. It's not my missing leg that hurts, it's the phantom family, the limb I lost that Thanksgiving when they revealed I was never really part of their body. You can't repair that kind of amputation. You can only learn to walk without it. My nephew, Thomas's son, reached out last week. He's 11 now, old enough to understand what happened. He apologized for asking why I walked like a robot and said he'd been taught wrong things by wrong people. He wants to be an engineer like me and help people who are different. I told him to study hard, that I'd pay for his education if he kept his grades up. Some cycles deserve to be broken. The Forbes article about my company last month called me the burden who built billions. I had it framed, sent copies to every federal prison where my family resides. Not to hurt them, they're beyond hurting, but to remind them that the man they tried to exile for walking differently is walking taller than they ever could. If you're watching this and facing your own family's cruelty, know this: their inability to love you through difficulty is not your burden to carry. Disability doesn't make you less than. Needing help doesn't make you weak. Using mobility aids doesn't make you broken. The only real disability is a heart that can't love someone who walks, thinks, or lives differently. My name is Marcus Delacroix. I am an amputee. I use a prosthetic leg. I take pain medication. I sometimes need help. I am not a burden. I am an inventor, a philanthropist, a survivor, and proof that the only thing more powerful than family cruelty is individual resilience. They thought taking my leg meant I couldn't stand. They were wrong. I stood in that courtroom and watched them fall. I stood as my company soared and theirs collapsed. I stand every morning on titanium and silicon and neural feedback, engineering triumph from their cruelty. The greatest revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something so beautiful from your pain that their cruelty becomes irrelevant. My family gave me the gift of their absence, the freedom of their hatred, the motivation of their mockery. In trying to diminish me, they amplified my purpose. 3 years ago, they said they wanted to live without me. Congratulations, they're getting exactly what they asked for. 15 to 25 years of it. Subscribe if you need reminders that surviving is revenge, thriving is justice, and walking forward, however you walk, is the only direction that matters.